Part 1. How the Habsburgs accidentally set Europe on fire again. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with something that, if you were a 17th century European noble, was probably your least favorite bedtime story. It's about the Habsburgs. Yes, them. The royal family so massive, so overbred, and so dramatically allergic to peace that they managed to turn all of Europe into a flaming pile of political kindling. So dim the lights, pour yourself some tea, or, if you really want to get in the mood, something slightly fermented and vaguely poisonous, like the wine they drank back then, and settle in. Because tonight, we're gliding gently into the world of dynastic chaos, inbreeding, and that special Habsburg brand of, oops, I caused a continental war. Let's start with a bit of context. The Habsburgs were basically Europe's answer to the family that just won't stop expanding. Imagine a group of relatives who insist on marrying each other for centuries, not because of romance, but because their family tree looked like a spreadsheet of property rights. By the 1500s, they had managed to marry their way into half of Europe. Spain? Check. The Holy Roman Empire? Check. The Netherlands, Italy, random alpine valleys? Also check. They weren't exactly winning at genetics, but they were definitely winning at inheritance. The family motto might as well have been, "Let others wage war, thou, happy Austria, marry." Which sounds poetic, but translated roughly means, why fight when you can just marry your cousin and get their land? So, our story tonight floats around the early 1600s. The Holy Roman Empire was, well, not really holy, Roman, or even much of an empire. It was more like a loosely connected patchwork of about 300 mini-states, each ruled by a duke, bishop, or some other minor lord who thought he was very important. And above them all sat the Habsburg Emperor, who theoretically ruled everything, but in practice spent most of his time trying to convince everyone that yes, he was still in charge. At the time, the throne belonged to Emperor Ferdinand II, one of the deeply religious and impressively humorless men in history. Ferdinand was the kind of person who could turn a dinner party into a confessional. He was a devout Catholic, which was fine, except that a large portion of his empire had gone full-on Protestant. You can probably see where this is going. Because, of course, the Habsburgs, being Habsburgs, decided to handle this delicate religious tension with all the subtlety of a cannon blast. Let's drift to Prague in the year 1618. The city had been simmering with tension. Protestant nobles were sick of being pushed around by their Catholic overlords. They wanted freedom of worship, political autonomy, and, frankly, a little less Habsburg. So one May morning, they decided to hold a meeting at Prague Castle. Ferdinand's representatives were there, stiff, smug, and probably regretting their life choices already. The Protestants made their complaints, tempers flared, and in one of history's more iconic acts of workplace conflict resolution, they threw the imperial officials out the window. Literally, out the window. It's known as the Defenestration of Prague, which is one of those fancy words historians love that basically means window yeeting. Now, the officials fell about 70 feet, but somehow survived. Catholic sources later claimed they were miraculously saved by angels. Protestant sources said, nah, they landed in a pile of manure. Honestly, both sound on brand for 17th century Europe. Either way, that defenestration was the match that lit the 30 Years' War. You might be thinking, 30 years? That's a long argument. And yes, it was. What started as a small Bohemian rebellion spiraled into one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. It was like if a local neighborhood dispute somehow dragged in the entire continent and left it completely ruined. So, how did the Habsburgs manage to turn one messy family drama into a pan-European bloodbath? Simple. They had too many relatives, too much pride, and too little ability to read the room. Ferdinand II wanted to crush Protestantism in his lands. He thought he was defending the true faith. His enemies thought he was an authoritarian zealot. The result was a religious war that turned political, then personal, then, well, basically apocalypse with bad haircuts. In the early years, Ferdinand actually looked like he might win. His forces defeated the Protestant rebels at the Battle of White Mountain in 2020. A battle that sounds poetic, but was really just a massacre with better scenery. The Bohemian revolt was crushed, the leaders were executed, and Ferdinand reasserted Habsburg control. But as with most Habsburg victories, it didn't last. Because when you're as powerful and unlikable as the Habsburgs, people tend to unite against you. Soon, Denmark joined the fight to protect Protestant rights, but mostly for power. Then Sweden entered the scene under King Gustav Adolphus, known as the Lion of the North. And yes, he was just as dramatic as that nickname suggests. And finally, France, Catholic France, decided to join in, on the Protestant side, because at this point, nobody cared about religion anymore. They just didn't want the Habsburgs running Europe. Meanwhile, back in Vienna, the Habsburgs were still convinced everything would work out fine. Because of course they were. They had centuries of dynastic arrogance to fall back on. Even as their armies were getting trampled by the Swedes, Ferdinand II continued issuing religious edicts like it was still the 1500s. He truly believed he was chosen by God to restore Catholic unity. And maybe he was, but it seems God had other scheduling conflicts that century. His family, naturally, didn't help. His son, Ferdinand III, was competent enough, but he inherited a disaster. The war had dragged on for decades, the population of Central Europe had been gutted by plague, famine, and war, and the economy was, let's just say, non-existent. By 1648, when peace finally came through the Treaty of Westphalia, Europe was barely recognizable. Whole regions were depopulated. The Holy Roman Empire was more symbolic than sovereign. And the Habsburg dream of a united Catholic Europe was dead, buried under 30 years of ruin and regret. And yet, the Habsburgs survived. Because of course they did! Like some kind of dynastic hydra, you cut off one head and another cousin just marries his way back into power. They learned absolutely nothing from the 30 Years' War. Within decades, they were back at it, fighting wars of succession, meddling in Italy, and producing more genetically identical heirs with jawlines that could chip stone. The irony of the whole affair is that the 30 Years' War, which was supposed to strengthen the Habsburg Empire, actually broke its dominance. It weakened them enough that other powers, France, Sweden, later Prussia, could start nibbling away at the edges. But the Habsburgs, ever serene in their delusion, continued to act as if they were still God's chosen rulers of the continent.
All right, welcome back, sleepy historians. If you made it through the 30 Years' War without dozing off, or at least without throwing your tea at the wall, good on you. Tonight, we're slipping gently into something even quieter and, in a way, more tragic, the Habsburgs' obsession with marrying their own relatives. Yes, it's time to float down the murky rivers of royal inbreeding. Let's dim the lights further, take a long, calm sip of whatever you've got, and let's watch the Habsburg family tree slowly twist into a nightmare of jawlines and jawlines only. You see, by the 16th and 17th centuries, the Habsburgs had adopted a very simple but horrifying rule. Marry Habsburgs whenever possible. Because why not double down? What could go wrong? At first, it seemed smart. Keep the land, keep the title, and don't let some upstart duke inherit a patch of your empire. Genius, right? But nature, as it turns out, is not a fan of dynastic spreadsheets. When you marry your cousin or your niece or your second cousin twice removed over and over again, weird things start happening. Let's start with Charles II of Spain. He's a good example because, well, he's basically the poster child for Habsburg genetic tragedy. Charles was born in 1661 and spent his whole life looking like someone had sculpted a royal puppet out of mashed potatoes. His jaw was so large and protruding that historians call it the Habsburg jaw. His cheeks drooped like the curtains in a very sad theater. Charles's medical history reads like a catalog of things that go wrong when you have too many cousins in your family. He was infertile, weak, and prone to seizures. His mental development was, let's say, delayed, though historians are polite and call it cognitive difficulties. Basically, he was a walking, breathing warning label. But the thing is, Charles II still inherited the Spanish throne because, naturally, the Habsburgs never learned the concept of outbreeding. They stuck with tradition. He ruled Spain from 1665 until his death in 1700, and his reign was, well, he didn't exactly conquer anything. He spent a lot of time sick, bored, and surrounded by advisors who were basically babysitting him. And because he couldn't produce an heir, Europe braced itself for a crisis, which, of course, it got. Enter the War of Spanish Succession. Before we dive into that, let's float back a little and look at the Habsburgs' obsession with intermarriage in more general terms. Ferdinand II, whom we met in Part 1, married his cousin, Maria Anna of Bavaria. Ferdinand III, his son, married another Habsburg, and then his children, well, let's just say you start losing track after a few generations. The family tree starts to look like a tangle of ropes that have been knotted by someone who doesn't know how to untie knots. And it's not just cosmetic. Repeated inbreeding increases the probability of recessive genetic disorders. Basically, things that skip a generation and suddenly appear in a way that makes you question the value of dynastic ambition. Back to Spain and Charles II. He spent his life surrounded by courtiers and physicians who, frankly, had no idea what to do with him. The Spanish court was a sad mixture of pomp and despair as advisors tried to manage both a sick king and a declining empire. Charles had trouble walking, trouble speaking, and, because of his weak body, virtually no chance of fathering a child. His health issues were the inevitable product of centuries of carefully engineered Habsburg genetics. And yet, he ruled. Or, to be precise, he was the king. That meant he made decisions, or rather others made decisions in his name, and slowly, Spain slipped from being a superpower to a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, over in Austria, the same pattern was playing out. The Austrian Habsburgs were obsessed with keeping the Holy Roman Empire in their family. So they married their cousins, nieces, and sometimes more distant relations, hoping to solidify power. This produced some competent rulers, but mostly it produced children who were weak, sickly, or eccentric. Take Emperor Leopold I, for example. He ruled Austria from 1658 to 1705, and was married 3 times to Habsburg cousins, naturally. His first wife died, his second wife died, his third wife also died. Not exactly a record of longevity, though to be fair, 17th century Europe wasn't great at that. He did, however, produce an heir, Joseph I, who wasn't as frail as Charles II, but still carried enough of the Habsburg traits to be noticeable. Noticeable in this case means prominent jaw, some digestive issues, and a general tendency to overthinking everything. The family was remarkably skilled at producing rulers who were, let's say, extra. Extra jaw, extra frailty, extra dramatic size. By the 18th century, the consequences of these marital policies were obvious. The Habsburg jaw had become a defining characteristic of the family. Chronic illness was common, fertility problems were rampant, and political instability often followed because when the king or emperor is too sickly to rule effectively, the advisors gain control, and advisors are rarely interested in your genealogical ambitions. The Spanish Habsburgs, in particular, were a textbook case. Charles II's death in 1700 without an heir threw Europe into the War of Spanish Succession. France, Austria, England, the Netherlands all scrambled to claim parts of Spain or influence the new succession. The Habsburgs had overbred themselves into extinction in Spain. And yet, in Austria, they continued, because lessons are for other people. Let's float for a moment to the human side of it. These were not just political pawns, they were people. Sickly, fragile, and trapped in a web of expectation. Imagine being born into a palace, surrounded by tutors and courtiers, expected to marry your cousin, produce heirs, and maintain an empire, all while struggling with serious health problems. That's Charles II's entire life. It's tragic and slightly absurd. And even healthy Habsburgs weren't particularly happy. Leopold I, for example, spent years obsessing over the proper way to arrange marriages, treaties, and alliances. His personal life was tightly controlled. He had little freedom, and his children's marriages were less about love and more about land acquisition. Romantic notions of happily ever after didn't really exist. And then there's the irony. The Habsburgs' obsession with keeping power in the family, the very thing that seemed smart, actually weakened them over time. By the 18th century, the Austrian Habsburgs were still powerful, but their Spanish cousins had gone extinct. Their family tree had become a warning, too much inbreeding, and the empire suffers physically and politically. Yet, predictably, the Habsburgs carried on. They never stopped marrying cousins, because why would you when tradition, pride, and the faint hope of maintaining dynastic purity are at stake? They were committed to the idea that bloodline mattered more than survival. By now the lesson is clear. The Habsburgs didn't just spark wars, they slowly sabotaged their own bodies. They were victims of their own success. Generations of planning, marrying, and securing lands produced rulers who were weak, sickly, and often incapable of producing the next generation, which, for a family obsessed with dynasties, was inconvenient. But life went on. The empire persisted. Advisors managed fragile rulers, armies continued to march, and Europe continued to fight wars over religion, territory, and succession, all while the Habsburgs perfected the art of looking imposing in portraits, despite often being barely able to stand in real life. So as we gently drift toward the end of this part of our story, take a moment to consider the Habsburgs, in their quest for control, managed to produce some of Europe's most infamous genetic tragedies. Their empire survived wars, plagues, and rebellion, but their family, at times, looked like it could barely survive a dinner party. In Part 3, we'll float into the world of Habsburg personal life, spoiled children, eccentric habits, and the kind of royal meltdowns that make you thankful your family is just mildly dysfunctional. We'll see how being Habsburg wasn't just a political responsibility, it was an emotional roller coaster with very little chance of happiness.
Part 3. Royal Children, Meltdowns, and Eccentric Habits. Life in a Habsburg Palace. Welcome back, sleepy historians. If you've been following along, by now you know the Habsburgs were masters at dynastic strategy, geniuses at sparking continental wars, and, somewhat ironically, terrible at producing healthy heirs. Tonight, we drift gently into the quieter, more personal side of Habsburg life. The spoiled, sickly, eccentric children, and the odd habits that filled the gilded halls of their palaces. So dim your lights a bit more, maybe stretch your legs, and let's tiptoe into the nursery corridors and drawing rooms where some of Europe's most fragile heirs spent their days. First, let's talk about the children themselves. Being born a Habsburg wasn't just about privilege. It was a complicated mix of expectation, confinement, and a very high probability of sickness. Imagine being a toddler, swaddled in silks, constantly reminded that your main purpose in life is to maintain the family empire, and simultaneously prone to seizures or a jawline that made eating tricky. That was the Habsburg childhood. Take the case of little Maria Theresa, long before she became the formidable Empress of Austria. As a child, she was surrounded by tutors, advisors, and nannies who monitored her constantly. Meals, study hours, prayers, all strictly regimented. And while she would eventually grow into a politically savvy ruler, her early life was more like living in a golden cage than enjoying childhood. Her siblings fared worse. Chronic illness, fevers, and weak bones were common. Some of her cousins literally couldn't walk properly due to inherited conditions. The Habsburgs didn't exactly win the lottery of genetics, and childhood was often a quiet battle against frailty. And then there were the meltdowns. Let's be clear. Spoiled children weren't unusual in royal courts, but combine spoiled with chronic illness, overprotective caregivers, and enormous dynastic expectations, and you get some dramatic flair. For instance, Emperor Joseph II, a later Habsburg, had a tendency to tantrum when things didn't go his way. Though tantrum in this context might involve slamming doors, lecturing ministers for hours, or declaring sudden policy changes on a whim. He was brilliant, but his moods could swing from philosophical meditation to absolute fury over minor annoyances. The family eventually learned to walk on eggshells around him. Now let's float over to the habits that made Habsburg life unique. These royals were known for odd routines and eccentricities, often dictated by their fragile health. Some rulers were obsessed with diet, constantly experimenting with foods that might extend their lifespan. Others had peculiar sleeping arrangements, often dictated by both superstition and the need to monitor their health. Take Charles II again, the Spanish Habsburg. He spent much of his life under strict supervision, which included carefully measured meals, gentle exercise, and a bewildering number of attendants. He was not particularly happy about this. Diaries from the time mentioned his impatience, occasional bursts of anger, and endless complaints about the lack of privacy. Not exactly a recipe for a fun childhood. And yet, despite their restrictions, the Habsburgs often developed remarkably refined tastes. Music, painting, and literature were a major part of daily life, partly to distract from their illnesses and partly to cultivate an image of sophistication. If you look at portraits from the era, you'll see this. Finely dressed children with delicate hands posed carefully to mask any physical frailty. Let's talk briefly about marriage prospects, because even children were political tools. A Habsburg child, especially a daughter, was basically a living treaty. From a very young age, she might be promised to a distant cousin, a foreign prince, or a minor king. Love was rarely part of the equation. Duty, alliances, and property were everything. One particularly famous case was Maria Anna of Austria, who married her cousin Charles II of Spain. The same Charles II with the infamous jaw. She was barely a teenager when the marriage was arranged. Personal happiness was secondary. Health was often precarious, and the pressure to produce an heir was immense. It's hard to imagine a more intense form of childhood stress. Now let's drift into another quieter, yet slightly tragic aspect, the emotional lives of these children. Many Habsburgs were chronically ill, painfully aware of their own fragility, and yet constantly reminded of the family's lofty ambitions. Anxiety, depression, and mood swings were probably more common than anyone at the court dared to admit. For example, Emperor Ferdinand IV of Germany, another Habsburg, died at 19. He was described as intelligent and thoughtful, but prone to melancholic moods, perhaps exacerbated by constant illness and the overwhelming expectations placed on him. The combination of overprotection, duty, and health issues created a very heavy atmosphere for children born into this family. Of course, there were lighter quirks, too. Habsburg children were sometimes spoiled in ways only royalty could manage. Endless tutors, mountains of toys, well, for the time. Elaborate costumes and access to music and art meant their daily life was strangely lavish. But all this luxury existed alongside strict control. Imagine a child with every toy imaginable, yet forbidden to leave the palace, touch certain objects, or eat foods deemed unhealthy by the court physician. That was a Habsburg childhood in a nutshell. Abundance, tempered by regulation, and freedom, heavily restricted. And we can't ignore the Habsburg obsession with etiquette. Children were trained in proper posture, speaking style, and gestures from a very young age. Nap times, meals, and even walks in the gardens were meticulously scheduled. While this might sound tedious, it was intended to produce rulers who were disciplined and capable of representing the empire with dignity. Unfortunately, it often produced brittle personalities and subtle social anxieties. Meanwhile, health crises were never far away. Measles, smallpox, and other illnesses swept through the court. Children might recover only to fall ill again, a cycle repeated across generations. Caregivers and physicians worked tirelessly, but medicine in the 17th and 18th centuries was rudimentary. Bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and strange tonics were standard. Some children survived against the odds. Others, tragically, did not. And so, life in the palace was a constant balancing act between indulgence and control, health and fragility, duty and childhood. It was a delicate, exhausting, and often lonely existence. Yet, despite all these challenges, some Habsburg children grew into formidable adults. Maria Theresa, for instance, became a powerful ruler, navigating the complexities of European politics with intelligence and determination. Her early life of strict routines and education gave her the tools she needed to survive and even thrive in a world dominated by dynastic expectations. Others were less fortunate. Some died young, some spent their lives confined by illness, and some were burdened with the twin weight of fragile health and family expectations, creating a perfect storm of melancholy, eccentricity, and quiet despair. So as we gently drift to the end of this part, take a moment to imagine those palace halls, soft carpets, glimmering chandeliers, and children wrapped in silk, silently navigating the strange combination of privilege and fragility. It's not dramatic in a fiery way. It's quiet, subtle, and just a little sad. Perfect for a calm, sleepy evening of history.
Part 4. The slow decline of the Habsburgs and their legacy. Welcome back, gentle historians. By now, we've wandered through Habsburg wars, tragic genetics, and the oddly melancholic lives of their children. Tonight, in this final part, we drift toward the subtle, slow decline of this legendary dynasty and consider what their quirks, misfortunes, and obsessions left behind for Europe and for history. So settle in, perhaps stretch your legs one last time, and let's float through the twilight of a family that ruled for centuries yet struggled to survive itself. After the tragedies of Charles II's reign in Spain, the Habsburgs in Austria quietly maintained power, but their world had subtly shifted. The 30 Years' War had weakened the empire, drained populations, and scattered resources. Ferdinand III's successors managed to hold on to the title of Holy Roman Emperor, but by the 18th century, the Habsburgs faced new rivals: Prussia, France, and eventually Russia, all of whom had learned from the mistakes of the Habsburgs. The empire was still vast, but the political landscape had become a chessboard with far more players than the Habsburgs could comfortably control. Their dynastic obsession, so effective in consolidating power in the past, now became a liability, They married cousins, nieces, and distant relatives in an attempt to secure alliances, but each generation brought further complications: weak heirs, fragile rulers, and occasionally comically unfortunate jawlines. Let's take a quiet look at Maria Theresa, who reigned from 1440 to 1780. She's famous for being competent, energetic, and reform-minded, yet her personal life was a continuous exercise in dynastic management. She married Francis I, a Habsburg cousin, naturally, and together they had 16 children. Yes, 16. You might imagine the palace as a chaotic, noisy place, but it was also a carefully controlled breeding ground for European alliances. Some of her children became rulers, some married into other royal families, and some, well, inherited the family tendency toward illness and eccentricity. Joseph II, her eldest son, spent much of his reign trying to modernize the empire, only to meet resistance from the entrenched nobility. Leopold II, her second son, inherited a tricky empire with fragile political foundations, and so on through generation after generation, a mix of competence, eccentricity, and health quirks. The Habsburg jaw, now iconic, remained a visual reminder of centuries of intermarriage. Portraits from the 18th century show rulers with protruding jaws, elongated faces, and slightly awkward features, often posed with a dignity that belied their actual fragility. Yet despite these physical peculiarities, the Habsburgs remained politically significant. They mastered the art of diplomacy, cautious reform, and strategic marriages, all while occasionally sighing over the limitations of their own bodies. By the 19th century, the Habsburg Empire was a sprawling but increasingly fragile construct. World War I, though largely caused by a tangle of alliances and nationalism, ultimately dissolved the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Habsburgs survived as a family, but centuries of careful planning, intermarriage, and dynastic obsession could not protect them from the tidal wave of modern history. And yet, in a quiet, almost poetic sense, the Habsburgs' legacy lives on. They shaped European borders, influenced international law, and left behind a cultural and architectural footprint that endures. Their palaces, art collections, and political precedents remind us of a family that, despite its quirks and fragility, profoundly influenced the continent for hundreds of years. So what can we learn from the Habsburgs? Maybe it's this: power, privilege, and careful planning can achieve remarkable things, but they cannot control biology, human emotion, or the subtle, slow currents of history. The family that produced mighty emperors also produced fragile children. The rulers who orchestrated wars and marriages also struggled with illness, melancholia, and eccentric habits. And the dynasty that once seemed invincible ultimately had to confront the limits of its own humanity. It's a gentle, quiet lesson, perfect for a sleepy evening of history. The Habsburgs were not villains, nor were they heroes. They were humans, entirely human, but living under pressures and expectations that few of us could imagine. Their story is one of ambition, misfortune, and the subtle, sometimes tragic beauty of history unfolding in real time. So as you settle into your chair or bed, perhaps sipping the last of your tea, remember this: the Habsburgs shaped Europe, sparked wars, suffered from their own genetic experiments, and lived lives both luxurious and lonely. Their legacy is a tapestry of triumphant tragedy, woven gently across centuries, leaving us with portraits, palaces, and quiet lessons on the limits of human ambition. And with that, we drift softly to the end of our story. Sleepy historians, rest well. Europe's past is vast, strange, and occasionally tragic, but it is also full of quiet wonders for those who take the time to notice.